72 hours away from eviction, a desperate father spent his last $150 on a rotting, asbestos-filled brass factory. Everyone called him a fool. But what lay buried beneath 70 years of industrial soot in the basement furnace room would rewrite history and make him a multi-millionaire. Arthur Pendleton was a man backed into the tightest corner of his life. At 34, he possessed the rugged, calloused hands of a lifelong carpenter. But physical labor alone couldn't dig him out of the $84,000 mountain of medical debt his late wife, Claire, had left behind. When the cancer finally took her, it didn't just break Arthur's heart. It systematically dismantled his life. Now it was just Arthur and his 8-year-old son, Toby, living in a drafty rental house in the Rust Belt town of Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, with a landlord who had just handed them a 3-day vacate notice. It was a frigid Tuesday morning in late October when Arthur found himself sitting in the back row of the Oak Haven County Courthouse. The county was holding its annual tax deed auction, liquidating abandoned properties that had sat rotting on the city's ledger for decades. Most of the men in the room were wealthy real estate developers, sharks in tailored suits looking to snatch up foreclosed residential lots for pennies. Arthur didn't fit in. He wore a faded flannel jacket and steel-toed boots, clutching a folded coffee-stained county plat map in his trembling hands. He only had $180 to his name. "Item 44, Richard Gable," the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls. Gable adjusted his glasses, looking at the docket with a mix of disgust and amusement. The old Caldwell and Sons brass works facility. 4 acres, 40,000 square feet of industrial space, condemned since 1988. Opening bid, let's say $500. Silence filled the room. A few developers chuckled. Harrison Cole, a prominent local contractor with a reputation for ruthless business tactics, leaned back in his chair and scoffed loudly. "Richard, you couldn't pay me to take that environmental disaster," Cole called out. "The lead paint and asbestos cleanup alone would cost $500,000. The place is a liability." "Do I hear 300? Gable asked, ignoring Cole. More silence. The auctioneer sighed, preparing to strike his gavel and return the property to the county's unsellable list. $150. Final offer before we move on. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew something Harrison Cole and the other arrogant developers didn't. For the past 3 nights, Arthur had pored over the original 1920s zoning blueprints at the public library. The Caldwell facility was indeed an environmental nightmare, except for Lot 44. The toxic smelting, the chemical baths, and the heavy lead processing had all taken place on Lot 45, the adjacent northern parcel. Lot 44 was purely the administrative wing, the packaging warehouse, and the old steam power generation basement. It was totally clean. More importantly, it was built entirely out of first-generation, kiln-fired red brick and virgin heart pine timber. Reclaimed antique brick, sold for $2 apiece to boutique builders in New York. Heart pine beams could fetch thousands. Arthur didn't see a ruined factory. He saw an $80,000 salvage yard that just required sweat equity. Arthur's hand shot up. The entire room turned to look at him. Gable blinked, surprised. "I have $150 in the back. Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Pendleton." When the gavel cracked, Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had just spent rent money on a dilapidated ruin. As he walked to the clerk's desk to sign the deed, Harrison Cole stepped into his path. An arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "You're a fool, Artie. Cole sneered, looking down at Arthur's scuffed boots. "You think you're going to pull scrap metal out of that death trap? The roof is caved in, and the city inspector will shut you down the second you swing a hammer. You just bought your own financial grave." "I'll take my chances, Harrison," Arthur muttered, pushing past him to sign the papers. That afternoon, Arthur picked Toby up from school and drove straight to the outskirts of Oakhaven. The Caldwell Brass Works loomed against the grey autumn sky, like a decaying Gothic cathedral. Its massive smokestack was crumbling, and the towering, arched windows were shattered, looking like jagged black teeth. Chain-link fencing, woven with dead ivy, surrounded the property. Toby stepped out of Arthur's battered pickup truck, his small hands clutching his backpack. He looked up at the towering brick monstrosity, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "Are we going to live here, Dad?" "No, buddy," Arthur said softly, resting a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "We're going to take it apart, piece by piece. And it's going to buy us a real house. Our own house." Arthur unbolted the heavy rusted padlock on the front gate with a pair of bolt cutters. As they stepped into the main warehouse, the sheer scale of his gamble hit him. The air was thick with the smell of pigeon droppings, damp rot, and oxidized iron. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the cavernous expanse. The floorboards were swollen and buckled, and ancient rusting machinery sat like skeletal remains of a forgotten era. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced Arthur's chest. Cole was right. It was overwhelming. But then Arthur looked down at Toby, whose thin jacket barely kept out the October chill. His father-in-law, a wealthy and bitter man who blamed Arthur for Claire's hard life, had recently threatened to petition the courts for custody of Toby if Arthur couldn't prove financial stability. Arthur wasn't just fighting for money. He was fighting to keep the only family he had left. Arthur grabbed his crowbar from his tool belt. "All right, Tobe, let's find an office to set you up with your homework. Dad's got a lot of work to do." The first 3 weeks were a grueling test of human endurance. Arthur worked 16-hour days. He set Toby up in a dry, relatively clean former foreman's office on the ground floor, running a long extension cord from a rented gas generator, so Toby had a space heater and a lamp to read by. While Toby did his math homework, Arthur swung a sledgehammer. He tore down copper piping, stripped old electrical wiring, and painstakingly chipped mortar away from the valuable red bricks. His hands blistered, bled, and calloused over again. His back ached with a deep, persistent throb that kept him awake at night in their cheap motel room, the last resort after their landlord had finally locked them out. By the end of week 3, Arthur had managed to sell 2 truckloads of salvaged brick and copper wire to a scrap yard in the next county. It brought in barely enough to cover the motel, food, and the rental generator. The easy scrap was gone. The heart pine beams were too high up and required scaffolding he couldn't afford. Desperation began to creep back in. He needed a big score, something he could extract quickly. That's when Arthur turned his attention to the sub-basement. According to the old blueprints, the basement housed the primary steam generation furnace, a colossal cast-iron beast that powered the factory's belts and pulleys before electricity took over. High-grade industrial cast iron was selling at a premium. If Arthur could cut the furnace down with an acetylene torch, he could make $5,000 in a single weekend. On a rainy Thursday evening, after Toby had fallen asleep on a cot in the foreman's office, Arthur took a heavy-duty heavy flashlight and descended the concrete stairs into the bowels of the factory. The air down here was different. It was dead, heavy, and tasted faintly of sulfur and ancient ash. His flashlight beam cut through the pitch-black darkness, illuminating a space the size of a high school gymnasium. In the center of the room sat the furnace. It was a terrifying, monolithic structure of riveted black iron, standing 20 feet tall and stretching deep into the shadows. Arthur approached it, mapping out where he would make his first cuts. But as he walked around the massive iron belly of the machine, something caught his eye. The furnace was built flush against the eastern foundation wall. But as Arthur shone his light on the brickwork behind the machine, his experienced carpenter's eyes noticed an anomaly. The bricks of the factory's outer foundation were weathered, irregular 1890s clay. But a 10-foot section of the wall directly behind the furnace was different. The mortar was a slightly lighter shade of grey, and the bricks were uniform, wire-cut masonry, the kind that wasn't manufactured until the late 1920s. Arthur frowned. Why would there be a newer section of brick hidden behind a furnace in the darkest corner of the basement? He stepped closer, squeezing into the tight 2-foot gap between the cold iron of the furnace and the brick wall. He tapped the masonry with the steel handle of his flashlight. Clack! He moved it a few inches to the left, hitting the older 1890s brick. Thud! Arthur's breath hitched. He tapped the newer brick again. Clack! Clack! It echoed. The acoustics were entirely wrong. Solid earth and foundation should absorb the sound. An echo meant only one thing. There was a void behind the wall. Adrenaline surged through his exhausted veins. He ran back upstairs, grabbed his 20-pound sledgehammer, and practically flew back down the stairs. He wedged himself behind the furnace, planted his boots firmly on the ash-covered floor, and swung the sledgehammer with everything he had. Iron struck brick with a deafening crack. Dust exploded into the air, choking him. He swung again, and again. On the 5th strike, the masonry gave way, collapsing inward with a heavy, hollow crash. Arthur dropped the sledgehammer, coughing violently as a cloud of 80-year-old dust billowed out of the ragged hole. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it through the breach. It wasn't just a void. It was a room. Arthur carefully knocked away the jagged edges of the brick and squeezed his shoulders through the hole, dropping down onto a hard concrete floor. He swept his flashlight around, his heart pounding in his ears. The hidden room was about 15 feet wide, lined with thick concrete on all sides like a bunker. But it was what sat in the center of the room that made Arthur drop to his knees. 4 massive military-grade iron strongboxes sat on a wooden pallet. They were thick, rusted, and sealed with heavy brass padlocks. Stenciled on the side of each box in faded yellow paint were the words, "Property of Oak Haven. First National Bank, Transit Department, 1932. Arthur couldn't breathe. 1932. That was the height of the Great Depression. That was also the year Oak Haven's largest bank had notoriously collapsed, leading to a massive scandal where the bank president allegedly fled the country with the remaining liquid assets. It was local folklore. Arthur reached out, his trembling fingers grazing the cold iron of the first lockbox. He had found it. He had actually found it. But as the beam of his flashlight drifted down to the floor at the base of the boxes, Arthur's blood ran ice-cold. The floor was covered in a thick layer of pale, undisturbed dust. Except it wasn't undisturbed. Right next to Arthur's knees, leading from a rusted steel door at the far end of the bunker, directly up to the lockboxes, was a set of footprints. Arthur swallowed hard. The dust around the prints hadn't settled back over them. The ridges of the boot treads were sharp, crisp, and completely fresh. Someone had been in this sealed room recently. Very recently. Before Arthur could process the terror rising in his throat, he noticed something else. The heavy brass padlock on the first strongbox wasn't locked. The hasp was broken, sheared clean off, likely by a modern pair of bolt cutters. With a shaking hand, Arthur gripped the heavy iron lid and pushed it open. The hinges shrieked in the silence. He shone his light inside. He expected to see empty space, assuming whoever made the footprints had already looted the contents. Instead, the light caught the unmistakable, hypnotic gleam of gold. Dozens of heavy canvas bags, stamped with the Federal Reserve seal, were packed tightly into the box. One of the bags had rotted open, spilling a cascade of flawless, uncirculated 1920s St. Gordon's Double Eagle gold coins. Beside them were neat, wax paper-wrapped bundles of $1,000 gold certificates. Arthur was staring at millions of dollars, enough to pay his debts, enough to keep Toby, enough to never worry again. Suddenly, a loud, unnatural sound shattered the silence of the basement. It wasn't coming from inside the factory. It was coming from above ground. The heavy crunch of gravel outside the factory's front gates. Then, the sweeping glare of headlights washed across the frosted, shattered windows, high above the basement level. Arthur froze, killing his flashlight instantly. Total darkness swallowed him. He heard the distinct heavy slam of truck doors. Not one door, but 3. Then a harsh, familiar voice echoed through the upper floor of the empty factory, amplified by the cavernous acoustics. "Look at the generator! It's running! The idiot is still here!" the voice boomed. It was Harrison Cole. "Check the foreman's office," another, rougher voice replied. "If the kid is in there, grab him. Then find Pendleton. He's down in the basement and he's standing on my retirement." Arthur's stomach plummeted into an abyss of sheer panic. Toby was upstairs, alone, and the men who had apparently been using this abandoned factory as their own private vault were walking straight toward him. The darkness of the basement was absolute, but the terror gripping Arthur's heart burned like a magnesium flare. The words echoed in his mind, "If the kid is in there, grab him." Every paternal instinct Arthur possessed overrode his exhaustion. He was no longer a desperate man in debt. He was a father whose child was being hunted. He silently slipped out of the hidden bunker, his steel-toed boots making barely a whisper against the concrete floor. He left the flashlight behind, plunging himself into complete blackness. Over the past 3 weeks, Arthur had memorized every agonizing inch of this decaying factory. He knew where the floorboards dipped, where the rusted nails protruded, and which stair treads could bear a man's weight without groaning. Above him, heavy footsteps thudded across the main warehouse floor. "Brody, check that little glass office on the left," Cole's voice barked, sharp and authoritative. "Mitchell, sweep the perimeter. Find the breaker box and see if this idiot rigged up any work lights. I want full visibility." Arthur gripped his heavy steel crowbar, the cold metal biting into his calloused palms. He moved toward the secondary metal staircase, a rusted fire escape route that led directly up to the hallway outside the foreman's office. He took the steps 2 at a time, keeping his weight on the outer edges of the grates where the iron was strongest and least likely to squeak. He crested the top of the stairs just as a beam from a heavy tactical flashlight swept across the frosted glass of the foreman's office. Inside, Arthur could see the faint orange glow of Toby's space heater. A massive silhouette, Brody, stepped up to the office door. "Hey, Cole! The heater's running. I think the kid is in here. Pull him out!" Cole shouted from the main floor. "Use him to get Pendleton up here. He won't try anything stupid if we have his boy." Brody reached for the brass doorknob. Arthur didn't think. He became a force of sheer, unadulterated momentum. He surged forward out of the shadows of the hallway. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to incapacitate. Swinging the heavy steel crowbar with the practiced precision of a carpenter driving a 10-penny nail, Arthur struck Brody squarely behind the knees. The heavy-set thug let out a startled bellow as his legs buckled. Before Brody could hit the floor, Arthur dropped the crowbar, lunged forward, and wrapped his thick, calloused forearm around the man's throat in a vicious chokehold. He dragged Brody backward, away from the glass door, hauling him into the pitch-black corridor of the old administrative wing. Brody thrashed wildly, his flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away, its beam spinning crazily against the walls. He threw a brutal elbow backward, catching Arthur in the ribs. Arthur tasted copper, but the pain only fueled his adrenaline. He tightened his grip, leveraging his entire body weight, cutting off the man's air supply completely. Seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity, until Brody's struggling weakened, his hands dropping limply to his sides. Arthur lowered the unconscious man to the floor, panting silently through his nose. He had to get to Toby. Arthur scrambled to the office door, easing it open. The small room was illuminated by the soft glow of the heater. Toby was sitting up on his cot, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He had heard the scuffle. "Dad?" Toby whispered, his voice trembling. "Shh!" Arthur commanded, rushing to his son's side and pulling him into a fierce embrace. He pressed a dirty finger to his own lips. "Not a sound, Tobe. You remember the game we play when we go hunting? The invisible game?" Toby nodded frantically, tears pooling in his eyes. "I need you to be invisible right now," Arthur whispered, his heart breaking at the sight of his son's fear. "Get under the cot. Wrap yourself in the dark blanket. Do not come out until I tell you it's safe. No matter what you hear. Do you understand?" "Are those bad men, Dad?" "They're just bullies, buddy," Arthur said, forcing a reassuring smile he didn't feel. "And your dad knows exactly how to handle bullies. Hide. Now." As Toby scrambled under the metal frame of the cot, pulling the heavy wool blanket over himself, the booming voice of Harrison Cole shattered the temporary quiet. "Brody! Brody, answer me!" Cole's heavy footsteps were approaching the administrative wing, the unmistakable clack-clack of a semi-automatic pistol chambering around echoed through the cavernous space. "Pendleton, I know you're up here. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Arthur slipped out of the office, silently pulling the door shut behind him. He retrieved Brody's dropped flashlight, clicking it off, and picked up his crowbar. He retreated deeper into the shadows of the catwalk, positioning himself behind a massive, rusted ventilation duct. "You're trespassing us also retressing, Harrison." Arthur's voice boomed out into the dark, intentionally projecting his voice to bounce off the high brick walls, masking his exact location. "The police are already on their way. I tripped the silent alarm the second you cut my chain." It was a bluff, but Arthur needed to buy time. A cruel, mocking laugh echoed back. "There is no alarm, you lying rat. The city cut the hard lines to this place in 1990, and the cops aren't coming out to this toxic dump." Cole's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, scanning the catwalks. "Let's stop playing games, Artie. This isn't about scrap metal. I know what you found down there, and I'm not leaving without it." Arthur gripped his crowbar tighter. "You mean the bank's money, Harrison? The 1932 First National Vault?" The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a dangerous tension. When Cole finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its arrogant veneer, replaced by something cold and venomous. "That money doesn't belong to the bank, Arthur. It belongs to my family. Arthur shifted silently behind the rusted ventilation duct, his mind racing. Your family? You mean Reginald Cole? The bank president who supposedly fled to Argentina in 1932. He never left Pennsylvania, you idiot, Cole spat, his flashlight sweeping dangerously close to Arthur's hiding spot. My grandfather was a visionary. He knew the federal government was going to seize the gold standard. He hid those lockboxes in the furnace room, planning to wait out the depression, but a massive coronary took him 3 days later. My father spent his life searching for the ledger. I finally found it last year, hidden in the floorboards of our ancestral home. I bribed the county clerk to keep this property off the market. And then you, some penniless carpenter, stole my inheritance for $150. Arthur processed the twisted confession. Cole hadn't been trying to save Arthur from a bad investment at the auction. He had been protecting a $20 million fortune. Mitchell, Cole barked. Get up here. He's on the upper catwalk. It's over, Harrison, Arthur yelled, intentionally throwing his voice to echo off the far brick wall. I've already broken the locks, but you can't carry it out of here alone. It's solid iron and bullion. You shoot me, and you'll spend the next week trying to haul it up those stairs before the city inspectors arrive on Monday. It was a desperate gamble, playing directly to Cole's greed. What's your proposal, Artie? Cole sneered, his heavy footsteps pausing. We split it, Arthur lied smoothly. You and your men help me load it. Nobody has to get hurt. I just want to pay off my wife's medical bills and keep my son. A long pause followed. Come on out, Pendleton. Let me see your hands. Arthur stepped out from the shadows, hands raised. The blinding beam of Cole's flashlight hit him instantly. Beside Cole stood Mitchell, clutching a heavy steel wrench. Cole had a 9mm pistol leveled directly at Arthur's chest. Smart man, Cole said, a wicked smile playing on his lips. Take us down there. Arthur led the two men down the creaking wooden stairs and into the sub-basement. Every step was calculated. As they reached the bottom, Cole's flashlight illuminated the massive, monolithic cast-iron furnace. Behind the furnace, Arthur said, gesturing toward the shadows. I broke through the false wall. Cole shoved Arthur forward with the barrel of the gun. Arthur squeezed through the tight gap between the iron furnace and the brick wall, stepping over the rubble. Cole and Mitchell followed closely behind, their eyes locking onto the heavy iron strongboxes sitting in the center of the concrete bunker. Mother of God, Mitchell whispered, seeing the glint of 1920s double-eagle gold coins spilling from the broken lockbox. Cole let out a breathless, manic laugh. He lowered his gun, walking toward the boxes as if in a trance. He plunged his bare hands into the gold. It's real. This was Arthur's only window. While Cole and Mitchell were entirely consumed by the blinding allure of the gold, Arthur quietly stepped backward toward the jagged hole in the brick wall. All right, Pendleton, Cole said, not looking back as he stuffed gold certificates into his jacket. Start grabbing the bags. Actually, Harrison, Arthur said, his voice dropping its submissive tone. I think I'll leave the heavy lifting to you. Arthur vaulted backward through the breach, landing hard on the ash-covered floor outside the bunker. Hey! Mitchell yelled, lunging toward the hole. But Arthur was already moving. He grabbed the 20-pound sledgehammer he had left leaning against the furnace. His carpenter's eye had previously identified a fatal structural flaw. The heavy 3-ton cast-iron side panel of the furnace, sitting directly above the opening, was held back by a single, rotting heart pine support strut. Arthur swung the sledgehammer in a massive horizontal arc, putting every ounce of his desperate strength into the blow. The heavy steel head connected with the rotting pine strut with a deafening crack. The timber shattered instantly. Deprived of its support, the colossal iron plate collapsed directly over the jagged brick hole, slamming into the ground with an earth-shaking thud. A massive cloud of black soot and rust exploded into the air. "No!" Cole screamed from inside the bunker, the muffled thud of his fists slamming against the 3-inch thick iron plate echoed from the other side. The bunker was completely sealed. Arthur dropped the sledgehammer, his chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He sprinted up the concrete stairs, bursting into the administrative wing. "Toby, it's over!" Toby crawled out from under the cot, throwing himself into his father's arms. Arthur held him tight, pulled out his prepaid cell phone, and dialed 911. The aftermath was a media frenzy that gripped Pennsylvania. It took a heavy rescue team with hydraulic jacks 4 hours to move the iron plate and arrest Harrison Cole and his men. Because the stolen funds were Federal Reserve assets from a defunct 1932 bank, the gold technically belonged to the FDIC. However, federal salvage and recovery laws mandated a mandatory finder's fee for the safe return of stolen historical assets. Arthur's cut was ruled at a staggering 12% of the total $20 million haul. 3 months later, Arthur Pendleton walked into the bank and paid off his late wife's medical debt in full with a single cashier's check. He didn't stop there. He hired a reputable contracting firm to legally clear the toxic portions of the Caldwell brass works, then salvaged the remaining antique brick and heart pine. He didn't sell the materials. Instead, Arthur used those historic bricks and century-old beams to build a beautiful, sprawling 4-bedroom house right on the clean 4-acre lot. He had a massive backyard, a state-of-the-art workshop, and most importantly, a safe home for Toby. He had gambled his last $150 on a ruined factory, and in the ashes he forged an unbreakable foundation for his family's future. If this incredible story of a father's relentless love, quick thinking, and a jaw-dropping historical discovery kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Arthur's journey from crushing debt to uncovering a hidden fortune proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are found where everyone else sees ruin. Share this video with a friend who loves crazy real-life plot twists, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories.